Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Tonight's the final night of our Education as Activism series, Welcoming the Stranger, Immigration Justice, Jewish Values in Action. At the beginning, you may want to sit down. I have a little bit to say. Pastor Rick, there's going to be a big build-up to you. Okay, at the beginning of the year, 4 of us randomly showed up to meet with Mickey Bowen to answer her question of what we thought was missing at Beth Torah and what we were willing to do to address our concerns. We talked about Beth Torah's history of social activism and the desire to return to the grand days of Rabbi Levin and his fights for justice in our community. The idea for this series was born that day, and I have never, personally or in my professional career, worked with 4 more amazing human beings that just clicked. We quickly decided what we wanted to do and set about doing it with the support of the board and Damien. Others with specific expertise, like the Education Committee and the Social Committee, quickly agreed to help. So first, I want to thank you, before we end this series, to Jennifer Levison, Marcia Rittmaster, Brandy Fisher, Damien, Mickey, Zach, Leslie, Jill Madoff, Becky Wagner. We did it. So if you don't mind, I'd like to give a quick overview of what we have learned in these last few months. We first heard from our founding rabbi, Mark Levin, talk about the connection between the Jewish people and our ethical tradition. He reminded us that Leviticus 19 commands that we love our neighbor, who is generally someone we know, but he also noted that it goes on to say, when strangers reside with you in the land, you shall not wrong them. The strangers that reside shall be treated by you as the citizens. You shall love each of them as yourself, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. He reminded us that Rashi says that whenever the term stranger appears in Torah, it refers to a person not born in the land, but who has come here from another country to sojourn there. How we treat one another is Judaism. It is the heart of Jewish ethics. I personally will never forget the emotion he stirred in all of us as he reminded us of that tradition, our 2,000-year history. He challenged us to answer the question, who is the stranger among us today and what is our ethical duty? And he asked us to decide what our response will be as an individual, as a community, and as a Jew. We proceeded over the next 5 months to learn about the plight of the strangers among us, most of which were doing everything right, everything they were supposed to do to enter this country. We first heard from Hillary Cohen Singer on Refugee Shabbat, who told us about Jewish Vocational Services, where she serves as executive director. JVS is the only organization in Kansas City that is exclusively dedicated to supporting refugees and immigrants from around the world. Founded in 1949 to support Holocaust survivors in Kansas City and support the Jewish value of duty to welcome the stranger, recognizing that all people have intrinsic worth and are worthy of our respect and support because we are all created in the image of God. For the last 25 years, JVS partnered with the federal government and USC Refugee Admission Program, the first stop in the United States for thousands of refugees fleeing persecution, dozens of countries, dozens of different religions, or no religion. But it was ordered to halt those operations on the first day of this administration, so it does not exist at all anymore. And that closure harms those in our area who were waiting for their families, who didn't make it through the process before the door closed, and those who were here under legal pathways, who followed all the rules under refugee status or even legal permanent residence, found that their status unceremoniously canceled or paperwork lost or the process slowed to a crawl, causing them to be detained until their status could be confirmed, threatening their jobs and their ability to survive. Although they were eligible for federal food security programs, that safety net too was stopped. The stories she told were gut-wrenching, that they continued to provide food and shelter for 170 families, 800 people out of the 7,000 that JVS serves every year, and 80% of them have a job and families with children. Many of these people were evacuated from Afghanistan as families who assisted the United States there are finding they have to adjust their status or find their applications are not being reviewed. So they have no status, considered undocumented, unable to work, and subject to deportation. JVS has only been able to continue its work due to the generosity of the Jewish community, who once again has risen to the occasion, recognized as our duty to the stranger among us. Next, we heard from an attorney who represented women who'd been fleeing from Guatemala and Nicaragua, women who came here legally seeking asylum in Dilley, Texas. They'd already been subjected to horrible abuse that they'd had to detail to a volunteer attorney who was only allowed a paper and a pencil to take down their stories of their asylum seeking. And they, as lines of other asylum seekers waited outside in the heat, sometimes all day, having to return to the next. These stories were difficult to hear, knowing that very few of them would be granted status and would be returned to their countries where they would almost certainly be killed. He talked about the process and the pathways that have been closed. It was a very difficult and uncomfortable conversation. It was a depressing discussion, and many were deeply disturbed. But as we know, not all education is pleasant. Then we turned the corner the next month when we heard from one of the most dynamic speakers to stand behind this bema, current and former rabbis accepted. Dr. Micah Kubik, Executive Director of ACLU of Kansas, talked about his agency's advocacy work for the strangers among us. He talked about the efforts of the president to get rid of birthright citizenship and as a deportation effort and the lawsuit that they filed challenging him. The efforts of the ACLU to address the Kansas legislature's efforts to stop providing in-state tuition for the Dreamers, students who graduated from Kansas high schools to stay in Kansas and get a higher education, but who brought here was children and had no control over their status, and a tuition forgiveness program that cost the state next to nothing. He talked about the ACL work trying to discourage agreements made by law enforcement agencies to agree to be deputized by ICE to do their work for them. And finally, he talked about the constitutional amendment on the ballot in August and its impact on immigration. He gave us hope that with the continued efforts of the citizens of Kansas, their positions would prevail. Last month, we heard from Zachary Mueller, a national community organizer who talked to us about how communities around the country and in this area have organized to address issues such as white nationalism, school board takeovers, and book banning, and more specific to our program, immigration. He focused on the struggle over who gets to be an American. And although deportation raids are not new, he showed how the scale, severity, and cruelty of them has changed in an effort to stoke fear and chaos. Which brings us to our last speaker tonight, Pastor Rick Behrens, a social justice warrior and a tireless champion for the community, especially those who have been marginalized or overlooked. He's a lifelong DOT, meaning he grew up, for those of you who don't know what that means he grew up in Wyandotte County, where he spent his entire career as a pastor of Grandview Park Presbyterian Church, in the Central Avenue neighborhood of Kansas City, Kansas, where I also grew up. He's graduated with a BA in Music and Theater from Ottawa University in 1981 and a Master of Divinity from Central Baptist Theological Seminary in 85. During his 44 years at Grandview Park, the church has changed with the neighborhood from monocultural lingual to multicultural and bilingual. The church has birthed the Prescott Neighborhood Group, AIR, Advocates for Immigrants' Rights and Reconciliation, which we've talked about here before, La Paz House for Children and Youth, La Paz Kids Club, La Paz Food Pantry, and La Cocina de La Paz. The church is an active and innovative force for justice and reconciliation in the community. He served as co-chair on the MORE 2 board, which stands for Metro Organization for Racial and Economic Equity. He also has served on the board of Mainstream Coalition. He continues to serve as a founding member of the board of AIR. He's a Rotarian. Part-time works for the Unified Government as a levee trail coordinator, where he works to educate residents and policymakers about the trail's potential for healthy and active lifestyles. Please welcome Pastor Behrens.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Karen, for that introduction. And thank you to Rabbi Craig for his warm welcome. And for, I've been here twice now. I came for Rabbi Levin's talk and I came for Hillary's talk. I wasn't able to come to the rest of them, but I thoroughly enjoyed them and I thoroughly enjoy your worship. And Leslie, I'm jealous of your guitar, your 12-string, but I'm even more jealous of your ability to play it. So it's wonderful. It's beautiful. So grace and peace and joy and beauty to you all this evening. I am Rick Behrens. I'm a grateful pastor of a small church in the Central Avenue neighborhood of Kansas City, Kansas. And I'm honored and extremely grateful to be here and that my friend Brandy asked me to be a part of this series. I do confess that I feel the weight of this moment, as it is the last in this important series, and I'm hoping that somehow I can add to the tremendous discussion that has already occurred, beginning with Rabbi Levin's proclamation of how central to faith caring for the immigrant is in your sacred texts that should also guide my tribe of Christians, but are often ignored by my tribe. I also feel tremendous weight because of this pandemic of hatred that is gripping our country, and the many who live in fear, and the many whose lives have been lost, both those in detention and those on our streets. I come to you today to just tell a story of a neighborhood transformed and rescued by immigrants, people who now live in deep fear to even leave their homes. A little background: Grandview Park Presbyterian Church, which I have served for 44 years, is neither in Grandview nor in a park. We are located in the Prescott neighborhood, which is part of the larger Central Avenue neighborhood in Kansas City, Kansas. We are a 136-year-old congregation that has been bilingual and multicultural for the last 25 years. Additionally, it was out of our basement, as you heard, 20 years ago in 2006, that what was to become known as AIR, Advocates for Immigrant Rights and Reconciliation, was birthed out of our basement. We moved out of our sanctuary and into that basement for worship after Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2025, when this president rescinded the sensitive locations memo, which had restrained ICE from entering places like this: schools, hospitals, congregations, churches. Since that day, a year and a half ago, we have worshiped behind locked doors. Being locked in the basement gave us a slight layer of protection, as what I like to call the goon squads would be required to have a judicial warrant to enter our locked building. We weren't able to secure our sanctuary like that, so we moved to the basement. We felt relatively safe and secure locked in our basement for something like 83 Sundays, until 2 weeks ago, when there was an ICE kidnapping 1 block from the church within 2 hours before our service was to begin. Now, you may not know, but there has been an escalation in ICE kidnapping since the beginning of the World Cup. And many of those kidnappings have happened within a few blocks of our church. When this kidnapping happened 2 weeks ago, 1 block away, just before our services, we immediately pivoted and decided we would offer this service both in person and on Zoom, because people didn't feel comfortable coming through the neighborhood. We are now on Zoom indefinitely, just Zoom, until such time as people will feel safe traveling through our neighborhood, which they do not now. And it's ironic, isn't it, with all the horrible things that some people say about crime in our neighborhood and in KCK in general, it's ironic, isn't it, that it is our own government that is terrorizing our neighbors and making us feel unsafe. It's also ironic and shameful to boot, is it not, that the safe places we call sanctuaries are no longer safe, are no longer sanctuaries, because we are under attack from our own government. But I think I'm preaching to the choir again, which I often end up doing. If anyone has the history, experience, trauma to understand what is happening in our streets, it is you, our Jewish neighbors, who carry generations of this harm and trauma in your very bones. The truth is that the streets of this country have become open hunting ground for our modern-day Gestapo-like troops to arrest, abuse, deport, and ultimately murder our neighbors and those who would oppose the destruction of our communities, as we have seen happen repeatedly just in the last few weeks. But to understand what immigration has meant to our community in the Central Avenue area of KCK, is to go back 40 years, longer than that if you wanted to, but 40 years is as far as I want to go back. 40 years to see what immigration can do for a dying neighborhood. And that's what Central Avenue was in the 1980s and the 1990s. I am an original Dot. I was born at Bethany Medical Center, raised in Wyandotte County. When I was born in 1959, the Central Avenue area and most of KCK was a relatively thriving community, a community with deep pockets of immigrant enclaves who celebrated their native countries as well as this one in which they found freedom and opportunity. But as you're probably aware, mostly Eastern European immigrants prospered, they began, like everyone does, to look for greener pastures and newer communities. And that desire was the start of an exodus from our neighborhood and our community. An exodus that led, for the most part, to the promised lands of Merriam, of Overland Park, of Shawnee, of Leawood, of Lenexa, of Johnson County in general. And by the 1980s, the neighborhood surrounding our church was emptying of residents and businesses. And I was part at that time of a neighborhood revitalization group called Central Avenue Betterment Association. In 1989, CABA, Central Avenue Betterment, brought in city planning students and their professor from K-State to study what was happening in the community and to make some projections and predictions about the future of the community 10 years down the road. And in 1989, those students and their professor predicted that by the year 2000, Central Avenue would lose 40% of its residents. Its business district would become a virtual ghost town with nothing but check-cashing shops and secondhand stores for its economic livelihood. Indeed, it wasn't hard to see that that was where we were headed. You really didn't need a degree to see what was coming. Our church had already become a remnant community of a few hardy souls who were just waiting it out, doing what we could to work with kids in the neighborhood, but not seeing a bright future at all. But what happened was no one saw what was coming in the mid-1990s to our neighborhood. About the time that the North American Free Trade Agreement was wreaking havoc on subsistence farmers in rural Mexico, that's when things started to change in our neighborhood. While the longtime residents of Central Avenue were heading south, new neighbors were heading north. A new demographic of immigrants leaving behind economic devastation and years of social destabilization, much of it brought on by our government meddling in their own self-determination. Just as Joseph and his family fled famine to survive in the neighboring empire, so did Mexicans and Central Americans who came to Central Avenue and similar neighborhoods all across this empire. These economic refugees now find themselves also in a similar position as did your ancestors after so many years in Egypt, becoming the scapegoats for the empire's sins. But what happened to Central Avenue after its demographics shifted from less than 5% Latino to 65% Latino in the span of 10 years was amazing. Through the industriousness of our new neighbors, many of whom were and are undocumented, Central Avenue was saved from those dire predictions of death made by those budding city planners in 1989. Central Avenue, if you haven't heard or visited lately, you should, because they need you now more than ever. Those businesses are suffering right now. But it has become a thriving business district with restaurants, small shops. It's the home of the KCK Taco Trail. If you haven't done that, you got to do that sometime. It is lively and vibrant. And over those years, the neighborhood actually gained population, and the school district began to reopen schools that had been shuttered for years. Nothing like what those K-State students had predicted. In short, immigrants saved Central Avenue, as they have consistently done with abandoned communities over and over and over and over again across this country and across the world. Our church still exists today because of our immigrant neighbors. In 2002, when the neighborhood had become primarily Spanish-speaking, our church, had to come to a decision. As the Clash sang in the 1980s, the question was, should I stay or should I go now? That was the question we had to face. And in 2002, we decided to stay and to give bilingual worship a try. You guys do that every week. We should have come to you for lessons. And we have been trying that now for almost 25 years. Back when we were first getting started with our bilingual community in 2003, the Latinas in our community came to our elders and they asked, what is this coffee hour thing that you do? And why do you call it coffee hour when max it's 20 minutes? Well, the elders, who at that point were all white and English speakers, said, well, coffee hour is an important time for fellowship. We share cookies and coffee and maybe on a special day, cake and punch. And the next sentence that didn't get shared was, then we all disperse with our families to Applebee's and TGI Fridays to have lunch with our families. The Latinas responded, they said, so it's supposed to be about fellowship? We said, yeah. They said, can we try something different next week than coffee hour? All us white folks looked at each other, couldn't come up with a good reason to say no. So we said, yes, do it. And the next week, as we read scripture and sang and preached upstairs in that sanctuary, we started to get distracted. The aroma was coming up through the floorboards: tortillas, frijoles, arroz, pollo, flautas, horchata. It came wafting up through the floorboards of the sanctuary. After a while, I just had to give up preaching, as it became impossible to ignore what was happening right below us in the basement. And when we went downstairs, there was a banquet spread for us. After that, our families quit going to Applebee's and TGI Fridays, and each week, a different family signed up to provide lunch for all of us. And we became a bilingual, multicultural community around those shared tables in the basement. We became a family again for the first time. A family for many whose biological families were thousands of miles away. Your world changes when you welcome your neighbors. We know that, but too often we accept narratives that really aren't faithful narratives, and those narratives destroy us. The narrative we're being offered now by our government is destroying us, destroying communities that have been rebuilt and causing those who did the rebuilding to live in fear. This is not the narrative of your faith or of my faith tradition, which owes existence to your faith tradition. Thank God. That first night of this series, Rabbi Levin pointed us to Leviticus 19, as Karen said, and the call to love the stranger as we love ourselves and treat them as though they are citizens. And why? Why? Because we remember. We remember being strangers. And your prophet Isaiah said that part of rebuilding the beloved community was welcoming strangers and immigrants into the community. And those scriptures and many others led Jesus to say that nations who welcome strangers welcomed him. And the writer of the Christian Testament's book of Hebrews reminded us Christians not to neglect hospitality, for in welcoming strangers, some have entertained angels. Theoretically, I'm probably the last person who should have anything to say about immigration. I've not gone anywhere in my life. My job for the last 40 years has been just a few blocks from where I was born. And yet, the world has come to my doorstep. And it has been the most tremendous blessing. And I'm not one to use that word much or to use it lightly. I like to think that I have done what the scriptures have commanded regarding my new neighbors. I like to think that I was the hospitable one, that I entertained people. But it's far more true that those angels have entertained me. It was the hospitality of those women who saw that our coffee hour was not life-giving and resurrected a family meal ex nihilo out of nothing. It was the young men who are now older men who built the homes in our neighborhood. It was the families who filled those homes with the loveliest, kindest, and brightest children I have ever known. It was the industrious men and women who rebuilt Central Avenue's business district. And now, after all they have given, after all they have built and been for us, it is those angels who are being called criminals, who are being hunted like animals, and who are being caged and shipped to places they have never even heard of. And it is downright criminal. And what's left of the soul of this nation is on the ropes. Our sacred texts call us to be keepers of our siblings. We are called to care for and love one another as we love ourselves. We're called to speak for each other in powerful word and protect one another with powerful deeds. But in spite of this assault on all of us and on our community, Central Avenue in particular, there is hope. In that very basement of our church where Eric got its start 20 years ago, young people like Zach Mueller, who spoke to you last month, and a few old people like me are gathering almost every night of the week to develop strategies to work together to protect our community and change the trajectory of where we are headed. Almost nightly, people are organizing in our basement space, underground, behind locked doors, to resist and build hope. And that is happening all across the metro, as I think Zach probably told you last month. It's happening all across the metro as rapid responders are being trained and people are learning about their rights, even in this climate that seems to say we have none. It has been said that hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. Hope is believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change. I believe that is the faith story that we people of faith share, is it not? To believe in spite of the evidence. It was that first in this series when I came here way back in February that I heard a phrase in your liturgy that has stuck with me ever since. Pray as if everything depends on God. Do you remember the second half? You probably do because you say it. Act as if everything depends on you. That was beautiful, and I've not forgotten it. There are two German pastors who are no longer around who resisted Hitler. And their names were Pastor Karl Barth and Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And they made two statements that I think speak to that piece of liturgy that I heard from you way back in February. Barth said, that to clasp the hands in prayer is the beginning of an uprising against the disorder of the world. To clasp the hands in prayer is the beginning of an uprising against the disorder of the world. We have to do that these times. We have to clasp hands in prayer across everything that we think separates us to inspire an uprising against this disorder. And that's why I'm so grateful that you've invited me and welcomed me here today, because we've got to do that. But it was the martyr Bonhoeffer who spoke to the second half of that piece of liturgy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said, "We are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself." We are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. Pray as if everything depends on God, and
act as if everything depends on you.
could I teach you a little song? Wow, music came just when I was ready. There's a little song that we've been singing and getting some hope from at the church lately, and it goes like this if you repeat after me. We will protect each other.
We will protect each other.
And we will be everything we need.
And we will be everything we need.
The good land.
The good land.
The wild water.
The wild water.
The whole sky.
The whole sky.
Is always on our side.
Is always on our side.
Pray as if everything depends on God, and
act as if everything depends on you.
the angels are waiting.